last we left our heroes, we were talking about ethical, the ways in which the Bible is used to give us models for ethical behavior. We're going to look at our sources of authority. What are the sources of authority that guide us when making our decisions? What are the things that we are appealing to, consciously and unconsciously, when we try to decide what we're supposed to do and how we're supposed to go? How do they relate to one another, and what happens when they conflict with one another? How do we relate? So this is where we're going this evening, is looking at the sources of authority, how they relate to each other, and what to do when they conflict. So I guess I'm going to start with that. So all of these sort of fall into sort of broad categories, and I'll give you the sort of 4 traditional categories that people look at when they're talking about sources of authority for Scripture, for ethical decision making. Scripture, as Sharon grabbed, tradition, and that is one that we can speak to as in the tradition we've received through pastors and parents, as you're talking about. The traditions we've received nationally, culturally, etc. also happens. Reason as a source of authority, as in the moral philosophies and scientific discoveries that we have, the sort of external measurements. And then experience, the sort of personal and communal revelations that we have living together.
And that's what Bob Wallace said. Historical experiences.
Historical experiences. Yeah, that would be tradition, very much. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Ironically, in this, the order in which most ethical theologians, Christian ethical theologians, would be thinking of these is the order I listed them in here. Scripture at the top, tradition, reason, with experience at the bottom. Yeah. I wonder, so I guess this is the should list in the minds of the ethics. This is what it should be. And
in the minds of who?
In the minds of the ethical theologians. And those ethicists do it this way. Let me unpack what each of these is, as Cindy was talking about. Obviously, Scripture doesn't need too much unpacking, but Scripture is often called the norming norm. In other words, creeds were thought of as normative for behavior and shaping behavior, but they were only considered normative when they were shaped by Scripture. Scripture is the prime, but not sole, obviously, not sole authority in the lives. And that Scripture where all authorities would vote, Scripture gets the veto. Scripture, obviously, when we're talking about Christian groups, we can't agree on that either. As Catholics have a different canon than Baptists, who have a different canon than Orthodox, who have a different canon than Coptic Orthodox. So,
well, not just the translations, but
no, that's the list of books. Now let's get into translations.
And what you believe based on what you read.
If you take seriously the miracle of Pentecost, they're all the Bible. Let's talk about tradition as an authority. The church's time-honored practices of worship, of service, and even of critical reflection, the way in which the church has read the Bible. I have always believed tradition is the way we stay in community with the people who have gone and been in our church before us. And so they were in our church. They are, just because they're dead, doesn't make them any less in our church. And the traditions they establish are the ways in which we stay in community with them. Some to be kept, some not to be kept. But I've always sort of seen that as the way we go. Creeds, classic works of theology, denominational statements, those are all part of tradition as well. And as you pointed out, the way families have raised us, we have our own traditions of reading sometimes as well as authoritative. And we'll unpack that a little bit more a little bit later. Tradition has a higher place of authority in Catholic Christianity than it does in Protestant Christianity. So, I mean,
Maybe officially.
Officially, I should say, yes. As an explicit authority, it has a higher place in Catholic Christianity than Protestant and Evangelical Christianity. But yes, certainly these play a role. But we've never done it that way before. Certainly exists here too. So, yeah. Reason, this is what you were asking about, Cindy. Understandings of the world gained through philosophical reflection, scientific discovery. All right, so, and unfortunately, this is culturally valued, and so it's a cultural dependent authority. Because Eastern philosophers and Western philosophers proceed from a totally different place, metaphysically, what makes the person and those sorts of things. And likewise, scientific discoveries dependent on the presupposition that science is great at proving the thing you're looking for. But those things we're looking for are often culturally conditioned, without even realizing that they're culturally conditioned. Sometimes they're culturally conditioned. So, I mean, we like to think of them as objective, And to a degree, they can be objective processes, but very often the presuppositions are not so. We can only discover that, what we're proceeding with. If you understand scientific discovery, you already understand that. I'm just great to discover vaccines. Harder to do other things. But it certainly does offer a context for Scripture. We can now hear Scripture differently as a result of some of these historical approaches and other approaches to Scripture that give us insight into the cultures around the text as well, that are a scientific approach, as best as we can do it within the soft sciences, if you will. And then the last one we talked about, experience. Private revelatory experiences are what we're talking about when we talk about experience here. Those are typically valued within ethical theologians and moral philosophers when they are confirmed by community. And the best example I can give of this is Acts chapter 15. The Acts chapter 15 is the Great Jerusalem Council, the first great business meeting of the church, when people were trying to decide, can Gentiles be Christian without first being Jewish? And Scripture would suggest no, and tradition certainly would suggest no, and on some levels reason would suggest no. How is it meaningful for a Gentile to acknowledge Jesus as Messiah when they're not, Jesus is the Jewish Messiah when they're not Jewish? And yet, the church's experience was saying something else. Paul's experience was saying something else. James' experience was saying something else. And so the church saw an experience that was confirmed, and I would argue, forced them to go back and look at Scripture and tradition differently to realize that maybe it's not quite so non-scriptural as they thought it was when they started that conference at the beginning of the day. So at the end, experience is an authority, but most of the time you want experience to be confirmed in a community before it would ever move beyond some of these other sources. So it is usually at the bottom, which is why it was surprising to me that it was at the top. So what happens when you have conflict between the authorities? And I'd be interested to hear some of your suggestions on some of these. I mean, the classic Scripture versus tradition example could be the Protestant Reformation, right? Where you have traditional practices by the Roman Catholic Church that Martin Luther is calling into question as appropriate based on what he sees in Scripture and the way in which he's reading Scripture. You could probably think of some Scripture and reason as authority figures here that might be So we're going to see, I think what's interesting about this is what we believe to be the most important authority and what we see as, what we evaluate in living as the most important authority can sometimes be two different things. What we say, oh, that's the most important thing when it comes to making decisions, and then you realize you're making decisions not necessarily based on that. And I think part of that, and this is a little bit of what Ron was alluding to at the very beginning, and I think it's important to see, is there is a stealth authority in this. And it's one that people don't necessarily talk about in this context, but I think it's inescapable, and that is interpretive communities. Interpretive communities shape how you interpret all of these sources of authority. All right? Communities are the ones that set the boundaries on what is legitimate scriptural interpretation and illegitimate scriptural interpretation. The traditions they set forward, those are the accepted communal practices passed down by the ones we've been in community with before. Communities determine what is reasonable, what science is science even at times, what's legitimate and what's not. Those interpretive communities can tell you what to accept and what not to accept. I would argue sometimes science doesn't care what you believe, but still within those contexts, people will tell you what is an authority and what is not an authority. Don't trust this, don't trust that. We all exist in multiple and at times competing interpretive communities. And I mean, you were talking about the interpretive community of your childhood that was providing guardrails on the way Scripture needed to be read. And there were interpretive communities in the 19th century on the issues of slavery and women's voting rights, and there are interpretive communities that believe things about the economy, and this is shaped by vocation or nationality or the ethnic culture that one is in. Different ethnic groups read Scripture differently, and that's an interpretive community. And when you come up against that interpretive community, It can be identity shaking. I mean, that is an issue. You know, what do you do when you're going to church and it says one thing, and you go to work and the science seems to be pointing you in a different direction than what you're being told, Scripture, the way Scripture needs to be read? You know, that becomes a crisis of when these two authorities are challenging one another. And I don't think we think about this enough, is the communities that we're in and how they value authority, right? That the individual community is valuing reason over tradition. Obviously, Scripture would be even non-existent in some of these interpretive communities. And so we are all a product of conflicting communities as we try to live and work and walk in this world. And it's a challenge. It's a challenge as we go. So, that the notion that each community shaping, well, let me go the other way, legitimate scriptural interpretation. I mean, this is one that's hard to, for me anyway, hard to overemphasize. Because a lot of times that's what I was coming up against in my students, right? These 18-year-olds who've been a product of a church who've been told Scripture is read this way for 18 years. And then suddenly I go in, and first of all, we're reading Scripture, which they hadn't been doing. They were listening to people tell them what the Scripture meant, but they'd not looked at the text itself. And I'm providing reason, cultural context for how to read these Scriptures. Suddenly now, this is a serious problem. Their community now has said that's not a legitimate way of reading. And the Underground Railroad of young women that I was getting to seminary out of their original churches, because they were coming from a context that didn't believe that women could have a calling like that.
But that's scripturally based. That belief.
Yes, their belief was scripture based, but so's mine. They believed it, but they believed it within a certain measure of control of Scripture itself. The community, again, dictating what you read and what you don't. What's fascinating is I've got that wonderful book, Genesis of Liberation, and it's antebellum interpretation by enslaved individuals. So pre-war readings of the Bible by individuals who themselves had formerly been enslaved. And it is amazing to me, because what I would assume would happen is, Master has this faith that justifies my oppression. I am rejecting this faith. And that's not what happened. What happened was, look at what Jesus is saying. That's remarkable. They didn't like Paul. They didn't read Paul at all. But they loved the Gospels. And they loved some Psalms that spoke exactly out of where they were. And what's amazing to me is reading that book and seeing these basically uneducated, bottom of history individuals reading Scripture and getting the truth of Scripture that I had to get a PhD before I could see it, because I'm reading from a different place. And that reminder that Scripture is written for the people at the bottom of history, and those of us in another place have to work a whole lot harder before we can hear it the way they can hear it.
But at the same time, there are people that have spent as much time as you.
Yes.
And have as many credentials
Yes.
as you have, that have a different understanding of many things in Scripture.
Completely, yes.
So how is that legitimate?
It's legitimized by their interpretive community. I didn't say I don't prioritize their interpretive community, or I'd be in it, right? But we've got competing interpretive communities that legitimize this. Yes, that's one of the things we try to break through. And that is exactly the reason the Catholic Church was against the printing press and people having copies of the Scripture for themselves.
Because they wanted to have
Because they knew.
the monopoly on understanding. They just wanted to tell you what the Scripture meant.
Well, you could read it if you went through you had to go through training in understanding interpretive methods and all that, and then you would be allowed to read the Scriptures. But you can't, the Catholic Church didn't just want anybody reading the Bible.
See, I get that.
Because, you get some crazy folks out there without proper training and reason and experience. It could lead you down an inappropriate way. That was the argument. Was it about control? Absolutely. But it was about quality control too. That's exactly the
Because
argument.
those people start churches too.
That's right. I am shaped in doing this by a Harvard English professor named Stanley Fish. He was not applying it to ethical theory. He was applying it to text, reading and interpreting texts. And his whole point was that interpretive communities shape what is a legitimate reading of a text. That's I thought he was right on that, absolutely. But you know what? He's right. I mean, the interpretive communities shape all of this. They tell you who you should listen to and who you shouldn't regarding scientists or what traditions are acceptable and what aren't, and what scripture is acceptable and what isn't. And yeah, I mean, it's these interpretive. You can't undervalue the communities we come up in and the tension of the communities that we try to exist in multiple ways that overlap. And I think that is why there is such value in the diverse community, because listening to people coming from another interpretive community with a different background helps to find the ways that we can get, for lack of a better term, theologically inbred without realizing it, that we can just be, in this echo chamber of confirmation bias and not realize that we've done that. And so, are there weaknesses to everyone having their own scripture in their own language? Yes, Bob, there are. There absolutely are. I grant that position 100%. And I can't, but the problem is, and I actually, as someone who can read Hebrew and biblical Greek, would probably be more inclined in my own self to want to make the argument that you need to learn the Hebrew and the Greek before you start reading the scripture. Just, you just can't just let anybody start doing that. It's so much more. And then God comes along. God comes along and works that crazy Pentecost miracle that I've got to deal with now. That says, even when you translate it, it's still the Bible. That it's still the gospel. That is such a radical miracle we don't take enough time to just see the awe of at times. That it is not the gospel in translation, it's the gospel. And that for all of textual variants they talked about at the women's retreat, and for all of the issues of translation and canon, at the end of the day, God says, that's good. That's the Bible, that works. Really? In what translation? In what English? In what version? What letter of text? That's the Bible, it works. And I sometimes come back to, I think, what it really helps me, the last verse of the penultimate chapter of John, when it's right before the fishing part, right? It's after the locked room. It's the locked room story, the Thomas stuff. Just to help you with that. The very last verse of chapter 20, that Jesus did a lot more stuff, right? And he tried to write it down and fill all the books in the world. But these are written that you might believe. And I get that sense of the Bible going, this is enough. Could there be more? Of course there could be more. We can tell you a whole lot more stories and a whole lot more stuff. But what you've got, it'll get you there. It'll get you there. It's enough. And so that's sort of where I sit in that as well. But I want us to be aware of these interpretive communities, because we're going to be saying a lot. When I was raised, where I was growing up, I've always believed. And sometimes you don't realize that we're just in the soup of these communities coming against one another as we start talking about what we believe and how we believe. And I think it's helpful to remember that as we go. So.